Blazor and Oqtane with Shaun Walker.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything the .NET ecosystem has to offer. This podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient and able to deliver world-class results. They are hiring architects and .NET engineers who would like a path to become an architect. So you can go to clearmeasure.com/careers. And I'm really excited about our guest today here on the show. My guest is Shaun Walker. And Shaun is the original creator of Oqtane, that's Oqtane with a Q, and also DotNetNuke, web application frameworks, which have earned the recognition of being amongst the most pioneering and widely adopted open source projects native to the Microsoft platform. He has over 30 years of professional experience in architecting and implementing enterprise software solutions for private and public organizations. And based on his significant community contributions, he's been recognized as a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, MVP, as well as an ASP Insider for over 10 consecutive years. And he was recognized by Business in Vancouver in 2011 as a leading entrepreneur in their 40 Under 40 Business Awards, and is currently the chair of the project committee for the .NET Foundation. Shaun is a Canadian living in Florida, and he's currently employed as the CTO of Professional Services for Cognizant. Shaun, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I am fine. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Exciting to get you on. You've done so much in your career. And I bet you there's plenty of listeners who kind of has seen your name and your previous work with .NetNuke and probably using Oqtane. But for those who haven't seen you speak or seen your work, just can you give us some of the highlights? What are the high points of your career that kind of have led up to what you're working on now?
Yeah, so I can give you sort of a quick summary. Obviously, I guess my claim to fame is that I created DotNetNuke, which was a very popular web application framework. Some would even call it a CMS, way back in 2003. And that was one of the first large open source projects in the Microsoft stack. It had a very large community around it. Had an interesting ride there because we grew the open source project to a substantial size, and then we formed a company around it. And then we subsequently raised 3 rounds of venture capital, grew a fairly big footprint in terms of customers. And so that occupied my life from, I guess, like I said, 2003 to about 2014, when I moved on to pursue other opportunities, stepped back into sort of the consulting world, focused on serving clients, doing, .NET implementations, which was really good to sort of get more hands-on experience again, because as part of .NetNuke, I was very focused on developing the product for a long period of time. And I moved up more into management, doing a lot more PowerPoints, attending a lot of meetings. And so it was good to take a step back and get my hands dirty with technology again. And then that sort of led me to Blazor in a roundabout way. It was about 2018. Actually, it was Scott Hunter who reached out to me. And because I have a sort of long relationship with Scott, he spoke at a number of the DNN conferences. And he said, have you taken a look at Blazor yet? It's this new thing that we're coming out with. It's a component framework. I think you'd really think it's interesting because of the capabilities that it might have for building, a framework like you did with DNN. And so I took a look at it, and I immediately saw that it had a ton of potential. And so I built a POC fairly quickly, very rudimentary, to try and emulate some of the concepts that existed in DNN. And I was successful with that, and pretty soon managed to release an open source project, and then I've been building that out since then. So, it's been about 3 years now. So I've gone through the Blazor progression from preview stage to .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5 to .NET 6, and so it's been an interesting evolution, but super exciting technology. I think that the future is super bright for Blazor.
Yeah. Now, some people are hearing that term Oqtane, thinking, "What do I put it in my gas tank?" Just give us a quick rundown. What is that?
Yeah, so that is the name of the new open source project that I've been working on. And like you said, it's got an odd spelling to it, so it's Oqtane. But it was a domain name I had purchased a long time ago, and as you're probably aware, it's pretty tough to choose unique brands nowadays. Almost everything's been taken. So I had this set of domain names, and I had like the Twitter handle and all of the essential sort of aspects of that brand. And so I decided to use it for the name of this framework. And essentially, Oqtane is much like DNN in the sense that it's a modular application framework. So it provides you with all of the building blocks as an accelerator for building a .NET-based application using Blazor as the front end. So it relies on all of the goodness that Blazor has to offer, but then provides a bunch of additional services which are not available in Blazor and probably never will be. So things like multi-tenancy, and it's got a working auth model, some more advanced security, page compositing model. So a lot of things that people would be familiar with if they ever use DNN as a framework for building applications. But of course, it was rebuilt from scratch using on .NET Core and Blazor. So the technology, like the architecture, doesn't really bear much resemblance to DNN, but some of the concepts have some similarities.
So, are there any public URLs that you know of right now that are running Oqtane that people could just kind of go and check out?
Well, yeah. So there's of course the Oqtane.org website, which is the main website for the project itself. There's also a site that is for the .NET Foundation. It is a site that maintains activity levels or captures activity levels on a daily basis for all of the open source projects that are part of the foundation. And then it does trend analysis of which of the projects that are most active. So keeps track of, which projects have the most pull requests over a given time period, or the most commits, most contributors. So that is dnfprojects.com. Also launched recently another site, which is also, these are all built on Oqtane, but there's a site I launched about a month ago called builtonblazor.net. And the reason why I kind of put that site up is there still is a lot of people who are asking questions about whether or not Blazor is being used in production, and what kind of sites are being built on it. And so that site allows anyone who has a Blazor-based site or sees a Blazor-based site online can enter the URL for it. It validates that it is in fact running Blazor, and it generates a screenshot of it. And there's almost 50 sites that are listed in there now. So with a lot of different interesting use cases.
Nice.
And I also thought it was interesting. There's like a kind of it can tell whether or not the site's running Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly. And it's about a 50-50 split, because that's also one of the big debates is, which flavor of Blazor should you be using?
Yeah, for sure. So which flavor of Blazor should you be using?
Yeah, I think it's it really depends on what you're trying to build. I think for internal facing applications and sites, Blazor Server has a lot of productivity benefits to it that make it probably a really good choice for building internal apps. For external facing, I think probably Blazor WebAssembly has a bit more advantages to it. It has some usability benefits that are advantages over Blazor Server. But I mean, both models are very capable. And in fact, Oqtane as a framework, that was one of the things that was important to me, is I wanted to be able to support both. So the actual open source project supports both frameworks in a single code base.
Cool. And I'm thinking that there's already a path that's been paved by some of the JavaScript SPA frameworks, React, Angular, Vue, and you think, okay, there is no server-side model for those. It's all client-side, right? We're using the client
That's
CPU.
Right.
So if we really compare, it's like, oh, I was considering Angular, but I'm going to use Blazor instead. It's kind of unlikely that you would use Blazor Server if you were really considering Angular. Is that fair?
I think that's true. Yeah. So if you were looking at SPA frameworks, like traditional SPA frameworks, and you were evaluating the typical JavaScript options, and then included Blazor in the mix, you'd probably focus on Blazor WebAssembly as the option there. You probably wouldn't have even considered Blazor Server. In fact, I think Microsoft threw the community for a bit of a loop, because when Blazor was first introduced, it was introduced as a WebAssembly offering.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, there was this other option, Blazor Server, and it was like, well, why would you do such a thing?
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But both, because they're both based on the same component model, and in fact, they both provide you with the ability to build an application that has the benefits of like a single page application in terms of interactivity. It's interesting that both models are actually pretty powerful.
Well, I've already found in some of my clients' projects, digital signage options are a lot more open because the server-side option exists. For example, the Roku powered TVs and the Amazon Fire Stick, and they don't support WebAssembly right now. Whether it's a hardware constraint or it's a compatibility issue, they just don't support it. But you throw in a URL into it and a Blazor server app, and now you have however big screen TV you have, and you have interactive digital signage. That is a .NET application. It's pretty sweet.
Cool. I think it is great that Microsoft provided that option, because you're right. Even though WebAssembly is available in all of the major modern browsers, there's still a lot of devices that use more obscure browsers, right, with more limited capabilities. So, and Blazor Server works perfectly there.
Yeah, and some of the recent viruses have forced them to update, and when they updated, they got the WebSocket support slipstreamed in there. So because all you need is that SignalR connection for server side, and you're good.
Yep. Yeah, and I think again, it's not just a Microsoft. Like for us folks that are deeply embedded in the Microsoft community, right? We don't always pay attention to what's going on outside the community, but there are other technologies that are doing similar things to what Blazor Server is doing, right? Like the was it the David Hanselman or Hansemeyer or whatever, the DHH, the guy behind Ruby on Rails, right? They came out with a technology which is basically similar to Blazor Server in that it's server based, and it does very sort of small granular user interface updates over sockets. So I mean, so it's not just a Microsoft invented thing.
Right. Well, I want to come back to Oqtane, but before that, we're on. We're at least version 3 with Blazor, if you count, the .NET Core, and then 5 and 6 and what in the previews. So you've made that whole journey. What are the big changes now that you're on .NET 6 that you've noticed? For those people who maybe either tried it in the .NET Core versions and they put it away, or maybe they haven't made the leap to .NET 6 Blazor, what are the changes or improvements that you've seen that really made a difference for you?
Yeah, so I would say that when I first got involved with Blazor, and that was in the preview stages, it was definitely painful because every new preview release had major breaking changes in it. But that's 3 years ago, and you could count on that happening as they were, building out the initial 1.0 version of Blazor. But then once Blazor Server shipped, I guess that was in .NET Core 3.1. The stability of the technology got a lot better. It wasn't, there wasn't any breaking changes, which, I mean, you come to rely on that fact from Microsoft, right? You rely on these very stable platforms, right? Without a lot of breaking API changes. And so in fact, like an application which is even quite large and complex, like Oqtane, has had not a very difficult time migrating forward. Like when I made the migration to .NET 5, I think that it took me like 4 hours to make the necessary changes. And most of those changes weren't related to Blazor. They were actually related to changes in .NET Core. And then similarly, moving from .NET 5 to .NET 6, it was very seamless for me. But I guess that's also, you have to keep in mind that the application sort of started at .NET Core 3.1, so you wouldn't expect a lot of breaking changes, I hope, between those versions. But yeah, like as the technology has evolved, certainly there's a lot of additional use cases that Microsoft has covered. The interesting thing is that even from version 1, the component model, like the core offering was pretty solid. Like it offered most of the things that a developer needs. And so in the subsequent versions, it's been more focusing on the more edge cases of what people want to do with it, right? And in some cases, the solutions to those edge cases are a bit challenging to implement, and so they're not always applicable to everyone. So that's one thing I've noticed in each like .NET 5, .NET 6 versions of Blazor. There's maybe new features that have been introduced, but they're not always things that I can take advantage of because they're more catering to a specific use case. But I don't know. The technology is definitely evolving quickly, and it's super capable at this point. So I think the one main thing, thinking about like the evolution of Blazor, the debugging story for client-side Blazor or Blazor WebAssembly was pretty limited in the early versions, pretty painful. You had to rely on your browser tools and like more archaic sort of debugging measures like print statements, in your console. But in more recent versions, Microsoft has really stepped up the story with the tooling. So it's made it a lot better.
They've gotten back to just mashing the F5 button like it should be.
Yeah. And then of course the hot reload and stuff like that also really improves the developer experience.
Mm-hmm. So you've taken all that experience and with .NetNuke and recognizing that probably half the audience, kind of got into .NET development after .NetNuke had, the conversation was different then. But with Oqtane, I'm curious about your 80-20 rule. You had so many features in .NetNuke that I remember. What things did you make sure to bring over, and what things did you say, you know what, I'm going to leave that there. I'm not going to bring it over because you have a different strategy now.
Yeah, so that's a good question, because I did go through that exercise of looking at .NetNuke and evaluating, what things are critical for building a modular framework, as opposed to .NetNuke was really trying to be both a modular framework and a content management system. And some people think that those are the same thing, but in my mind, a content management system is something entirely different, right? It's an application that's really focused on content scenarios, like usually is focused around a content repository with content indexing and search and localization and versioning and workflow. And, there's like all these different things. And I didn't want Oqtane to be any of those things. I wanted it to be more focused on an application framework that would allow developers to quickly build, applications on Blazor. And those applications didn't necessarily need to be content focused at all. So yeah, you're right. I stripped it down to more bare bones. Like I think that I still leverage some of the original DNN data model. But I like that data model, I think has something like 80 tables in it now. And I cut it down to like 12 tables or something. And I said, this is really the core of the system, right? And all this other stuff is not really necessary for what I'm trying to do here. So, and then as I've continued working on Oqtane and, building new versions, I've tried to keep that sort of core set of tables to a minimum, and not get sucked into feature creep, which always seems to happen. But so I think that that's really been the focus. Is I also created like an Oqtane philosophy blog that I wrote like a couple of years ago, and just outlining those things in words and saying, these are the principles that we're going to follow is something that I can always look back at and I can say, well, someone's asking for feature X. Does it align with these philosophical principles? Yes or no? And so that really helps.
Well, how many principles do you have?
There's quite a few on the list, and they're more generic, but they definitely have helped. And they also help in the conversations with community members because, like on GitHub, you'll get in these discussions and people will say, well, feature X is, critical for me. And I'll be like, can you read this philosophy over here?
And,
yeah.
Read the manual.
Well, yeah, it's sort of.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
So since you already have applications out there using the latest Blazor and people are building on top of your framework, one of the new features is the error boundaries. And I think I've seen some discussions or debate about, well, where should the error boundaries go? And of course, Microsoft is like, you can put them wherever you want. But, they don't really say, okay, really put them here. So does Oqtane just put the error boundaries so that the end application developer doesn't have to do anything? Or do you kind of funnel that through? What's your philosophy, or where have you seen it help to put those boundaries?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. First off, it's like what you said about Microsoft providing tools that are very adaptable to many different ways of doing things and no prescriptive guidance.
Yeah.
Right? That's like one of the use cases for having a framework like Oqtane, right? It gives you at least a direction to go in.
Yeah,
right?
do it this way.
Sort of, right, as opposed to like starting with a blank slate and going, which way do I go? But beyond that, so error boundaries, obviously Oqtane started at a point in time where there wasn't really error handling. And I learned that early on, that it was super painful if you didn't have exception handling in your code, that it would basically crash your entire app and it would require like a full restart. Not a good experience at all.
Right.
So then you end up putting like try catch like all over the place, right? To make sure that your application's not going to lock up and cause those kind of issues. And then you're right, .NET 6 came along and it has error boundaries. So I think in an application like Oqtane, where it's very dynamic and much like the way that DNN did things, it dynamically composites a page, right? So there might be like 3 or 4 different mini applications or modules, right? Which are running, they're all sort of separate DLLs. And at runtime, it's, saying, well, I'm going to put an instance of this application in this spot of the page and another application over here. It's actually quite powerful to have like a fail safe for those modules when they're being loaded to use the error boundary. So we have like this sort of module instance component, which dynamically loads any component into it. And that's where we put the error boundary so that, let's say that any of those modules don't have proper error handling. The error will only bubble up to a certain point. And then the framework's going to catch it. It's going to log what the exception was, but the application will keep its integrity, right? And it won't fully crash. So that was actually a big benefit. There was actually a community member from the open source community that submitted a pull request not long after .NET 6 came out and introduced that feature, when I was really happy to see that. The only thing is that also the typical examples that Microsoft provides on how to use error boundary didn't fit the DNN or didn't fit the Oqtane use case. So I ended up having to dig deeper into the .NET core, like GitHub repository and found some examples actually that Steve Sanderson had written, almost like unit tests for some very obscure kind of use cases. And those are the use cases that actually fit Oqtane. So because if the main thing, when you're using error boundaries in a standard way in Blazor, it allows you to capture the error and it allows you to provide feedback to the user, but it doesn't log the error to your logging framework, which is useless. Because you want to capture that error so that you can find out if that exception is happening a lot, right? And you want to be able to follow up on it. Well, the components for the error boundary don't make it easy to actually log anything because it doesn't allow you to actually call a service from within the methods. So it's a little tricky to figure that one out.
Have y'all figured that out?
Yes. Yeah. So there was a way that there was, at least Microsoft had thought through, like there was an event that you can hook to actually be able to accomplish that. But it was pretty hard to find. Like I couldn't find any examples on how to actually do it. So yeah.
All right. So anyone struggling with that can just grab the Oqtane source code and figure out how you did it.
Yep.
Okay. So another architectural decision that needs to be made here is about URL design. And in desktop applications, sometimes people say, you know what? We need to be able to open up the application and do some type of deep linking to open up the right screen and the right part of the screen versus, no, in desktop applications, let's just open the application and then they can go from there. But on the web, because of the web's history, a lot of us have gotten used to being able to bookmark literally any screen in any state in the application. And of course, with SPI applications, you kind of have to think about that and design your URLs intentionally in order to have deep linking.
Yep.
In your opinion, should we default to always caring about the URL structure, or should that just be a use case for only that subset of applications that need it?
I think it's important. I think, like you said, that people are used to having that capability to be able to do deep linking. And also other aspects of the web, like search engine indexing, crawling, all kind of relies on the ability to deep link different content, right? And sometimes in order to expose that content, you need URLs, which are pretty rich in terms of the metadata that they possess. So, but it is an interesting topic because with a SPA application, you really take responsibility for the router of your application. And most developers that are building Blazor applications are using the standard router that Microsoft provides, which has become, more feature rich over time. It was pretty basic to begin with. Oqtane is not using the default router. It turns out that the router in Blazor is just another component, just like any other component. And so in order to build a modular application framework that had, richer information embedded into the router, we needed to build a custom router. But then over time, that sort of custom router had feature requests like, well, we want to have the ability to embed, instead of always having to use query string parameters, we want to embed those parameters in the route itself, and make, those, routes with URL parameters embedded in them. And then we had to figure out, well, how do we differentiate between like things like multi-tenancy, right? Where we use the domain name and perhaps some subfolders to identify a particular site. How do we differentiate that from what the page is, from what the parameters that we're passing to different apps on the page are? And so you're right. You come up with like this scheme for dealing with it. And it's probably one of the most complicated parts because the decisions you make will affect the application forever, right? Because that's the part of the public API, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you design it that way, it becomes public API.
Yeah, and becomes hard to undo some of the decisions that you make.
Right, for sure. All right, there's plenty of Oqtane applications out there in the wild. What have you found any patterns specific to Blazor for monitoring those? like with application insights, are there any go-to charts or metrics that you all grab and put on your dashboard just because you've learned, hey, you know what, we really need to watch this or that?
So that's not an area that I've explored in great detail, is monitoring. And I know that's sort of like getting back to sort of the DevOps story. I guess because I'm running a few sites right on Oqtane, and I am using Azure, but I haven't really dug into the app insights too much there to see what benefits I could get by utilizing them more. I've never been a big fan of Google Analytics, and I shouldn't say that because it has its place. I just find that it tends to be very general in the information that it provides you, and it's like never really real-time information. So one of the things actually that is a feature of Oqtane is it actually logs visitor information for you, basic information about in real time about who's visiting the site. And I find that to be quite useful as far as understanding what's actually going on in real time on the site. But I think application insights obviously has those types of capabilities as well.
Well, that could be a testament to the stability of Blazor. If it's like, hey, it just works. So looking at how the Oqtane framework is put together, and of course there's other ones on the market like Sitefinity and other ones where you have to basically make your application a such and such framework application. Is that the same way with Oqtane, or can you have an existing ASP.NET 6 application and just make a few URLs use Oqtane? Or is it, no, it needs to be an Oqtane application and then put everything inside?
At this point, it's more of building applications that would conform to the framework. Although it's like this, the way that you build an Oqtane module isn't much different than the way you would build a regular Blazor app. Like it's still all based on Razor components and all the standard you'd still build web APIs, controllers. You still use a repository pattern. You'd still use all the standard techniques that you would use to build a bespoke .NET Core app with Blazor. But it's this use case that you're talking about, is sort of integrating an Oqtane application with perhaps another,
an existing one,
like an MVC app or an Angular app, or I haven't really explored those use cases as much.
Okay.
So I'm not sure.
And then final question, the rumor mill is that Maui's going to be released, anytime now. And Blazor, the Blazor component model is going to be a first-class citizen in smartphone apps and Mac and all. Mm-hmm. So does that mean, and are you thinking about that? I want you to just project into the future. Does that mean that the Oqtane framework can build smartphone apps?
In theory, it should be able to. Yeah, because the architecture that Oqtane follows is very client-server. So, and that's exactly the same architecture model that you would use for building mobile apps. So, yeah, I am pretty excited about the fact that Blazor has like you said, a first-class citizen story in Maui. Because I think that just opens up even more use cases. And that was one of the things that kind of hooked me on Blazor to begin with. It's like, yes, we had Blazor Server, then we have Blazor WebAssembly, and then they've demonstrated how you can build progressive web applications on it. And then there was some early work on Xamarin, right, to show the Blazor bindings in Xamarin. So it was just there was so many, and then there's the Electron shell, right, to build desktop. And there were just so many use cases that this one type of technology could be used in. It was mind-blowing. So yeah, I'm excited about Maui.
Well, I have heard rumors that the Windows team is actually testing Blazor for the Windows 11 Action Center and the Windows 11 widgets, because they they have the web view too on it. Now, I don't have a lot of information, just some of the stuff that publicly came out, and there's no Windows 11 Blazor project template just yet. But,
No.
When some people say, you know what, Blazor may be the next quote normal application type or the go-to application type when you just pull up Visual Studio, you think that's hyperbole? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I don't know, but I know that there's a lot of confusion with so many different frameworks, right? For web versus desktop versus mobile. And to have sort of one technology that binds them all together and provides like one story would probably be pretty beneficial for Microsoft and for the developer community. So if it goes in that direction, I think that would be a benefit. We shall see. It's probably, it's not easy to accomplish that, but it seems like that's the direction it's headed in anyways, or at least in theory, that's what a lot of people are excited about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I said last question, I lied. One more on your philosophy. You've chosen to make a C# framework. Kind of looked at Blazor and said, "Man, I've done something in the past that I think I could do here." And then there's also a lot of investment in low-code frameworks, and we always want to get the most done with the little effort. I mean, that's the goal. No one wants to do more work than you need to. And then there's the philosophies. So for people who already know how to program C#, let's ignore the people who don't and maybe are really good at Excel or whatnot. But for the people who know how to use C#, in your opinion, is it better to grab an application framework like Oqtane, or is it better to try to pull in some of these low code offerings in certain places?
So I think there's a lot of excitement around low code. And I think that some of the power tools from Microsoft have a lot of capability to them. Like they've matured a lot over time. But what I find is with most low code offerings, they only get you so far, and then eventually, and sometimes, they'll take you to the point exactly where you need to be, and it'll satisfy the use case, right? Whatever the business problem was. But often you eventually hit a wall with them, right? Where it's like the tool doesn't allow you to go any further. And then you're really forced to build something that's more custom, right? Where low code just won't cut it at that point, and you need to actually build software. And so I think it really depends on the use case. It's because it certainly is more complicated to build custom software than it is to use low code solutions. So, I mean, if you can start with a low code solution and it gets you part way, and maybe you can prove out that at least, that it's possible to solve the problem that you're trying to solve using these tools, that's fine. And then maybe your idea will get additional funding and you could build it out as a proper, custom software solution. I don't know. But I mean, you shouldn't go into a low code thinking that it's going to satisfy your every need. I don't think. Yeah. Even though that they're sold that way and they're marketed that way, like every tool is, but typically there is going to be some limitations that you run into eventually.
Yeah. Well, for people who don't know .NET, shoot, that's a pretty awesome value proposition. But then you say, well, I do know .NET also, so which one should I do? Yeah.
Well, and I would also say that like utilizing a framework like Oqtane, it also is an accelerator because it allows you to get a lot of foundational building blocks in place, right, without having to build them from scratch. At the same time, I would always encourage someone to build a Blazor app from scratch, right? Just to truly understand what it takes, right, to build a Blazor application.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we head out, the all the URLs that we talked about, we'll make sure to put them in the show notes. But for people who kind of want to dig in now, what's their best URLs to dig into Oqtane?
Yeah, so Octane.org is the main website. And of course, that'll link you to the GitHub repository, which is Oqtane, Oqtane.framework on GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see, that's where most of the community activity is going on. So we're using the GitHub discussions area there, or it's the issues. Those are probably the main places that you should look. There's also a site, Octane.net, which has a number of extensions, like similar to the way that DotNetNuke had a large ISV ecosystem around it of people who built third-party extensions and were selling them commercially. The goal for Oqtane is to have something similar. And so Octane.net will be that. Right now, there's a number of sort of free extensions that are available. The commercial ecosystem is yet to come.
Awesome. I can predict it will be coming. You've done it before. Well, thanks for coming on the show and talking with us about Blazor and Oqtane.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.